In his second presentation, Professor DeGrave is going to tell us a little bit about some different climates found in Latin America. This presentation is actually replacing the reading in your book, Chapter 3 in your book, so be sure that you take good notes.
Right, as was mentioned, most of Latin America is in the tropics, and as you can see on this map, the tropics generally refer to a relatively warm and humid climate. We think of, the Amazon rainforest or other rainforests around the world that are between the Tropic of Cancer and Capricorn. That is the definition of the tropics, if you're between those two lines. And so we often think of, oh yeah, if you go to Latin America, it's going to be hot, it's going to be steamy, it's going to be very tropical, a lot of banana plants and this sort of thing. But of course, as we know, it's not just latitude and how close you are to the equator that determines what the climate is. Obviously, elevation is one of those keys. How close you are to a major body of water, what direction the wind is blowing. And so it's not just tropical climate that we find in Latin America. So this graph here, with the map, shows you the various climate types, and geographers have spent many, many, many long hours making classifications. You can see the capital A and the B and the C and all kinds of sub-categorizations. For our purposes, we're not going to get into all of those details, but in the next slide you'll see that I've outlined some very general terms that describe these climates, and I'll try to give you an example of each of them to hopefully make it a little bit more memorable. If you want a little bit more information about climates and climate types and maps and so on, you can rent the Goods World Atlas that's available at the UW Eau Claire bookstore, and that atlas has a good section on climate to give you a few more details and additional maps and these sort of things. So here are climate types, and there are 7 major climate types in Latin America. You can see at the very bottom of this slide it says we have humid continental. That is our climate right here in lovely Eau Claire, Wisconsin. And you won't find that climate anywhere in Latin America. So we can sort of forget about trying to make comparisons to Eau Claire, because it's just not going to work out because our weather is not typical of any region within Latin America. But you can see the general types of climate, and these colors on this slide match the same climate types on the previous slide. And you can see tropical, right, that tends to be wet. Arid means dry, right? And then we've got a certain seasonal variations with some of the others, and then another couple ones that you'd find as you get closer to the South Pole and up in the mountains where things get a little bit cooler. So hopefully you're able to match up these climate types with the previous slide based on the color. Again, we'll go through these relatively quickly just to give you a general idea as to sort of the types and subtypes of these climates. All right, tropical, we can see we're in the rainforest. There are 2 types of tropical climate. There is the tropical rainforest and the tropical savanna. The rainforest is what it sounds like. It's very tree covered, right? You've heard of the Amazon, of course, and this is what we mean by rainforest. And you can see it really, really rains in the rainforest, more than 100 inches of rain per year, and this is the only climate where you get that much rainfall every single year. There are many trees, obviously, and very tall trees within the rainforest, but also smaller trees that perhaps don't get the notoriety that the taller ones do. One other thing that a lot of folks may not know is that the soils in rainforests are very fragile and shallow. We oftentimes will think, oh, the rainforest, those are thick, dense, very fertile soils. In fact, no, they're very shallow, they're very fragile. So when one destroys the rainforest, you're also destroying the soil, and it's not very likely that that rainforest will grow back anytime soon. And this is all part of the problem with the destruction of the Amazon, because once you take out the trees, the soil disappears because it's very shallow and it blows away in the wind when the trees aren't there to protect it. So it's a very closed ecosystem. If you disturb the trees, you disturb the soils, and certainly you can't plant those trees all over again once the soils have disappeared as well. So the trees act as a way of preventing erosion of these very weak and shallow soils. There's also the tropical savanna, and as you can see in the savanna there are fewer trees. It's still in the tropics, it's still quite rainy, but as you can see it's fewer than 100 inches of rain per year, unlike the rainforest, which has more than 100 inches of rain per year. The seasons, you'll have a wet season and a dry season. You can see in this slide it doesn't look completely tropical, right? You see some tropical trees, but you can clearly tell that there's a dry season that happens every so often. And if you're thinking, well, what's the savanna? What's it look like? We've all seen these shows on National Geographic Channel where there's the gazelle eating berries, all by itself, minding its own business, and then they cut to the cheetah hanging out in the trees, looking at this gazelle, thinking it might want some lunch, and all of a sudden there's a race, right? The gazelle's going 60 miles an hour, the cheetah's getting closer and closer, and finally, right, the cheetah grabs the gazelle, rips it from limb to limb, and so on, right? And this is where this occurs in the tropical savanna. Imagine if you were going 60 or 70 miles an hour in the tropical rainforest, right? You would probably run into a tree within about 10 feet. So the savanna is very much like a plain, a tropical plain, but it does receive very much rain throughout the year, even though there are seasons of wet and dry. And we can see it's like the Everglades, right? Very in South Florida. Florida's not in the tropics, but it's pretty close to what we would call a savanna climate. All right, we also have deserts, right? Arid climates. Arid means dry, but the desert is one of two different types of arid climates, and we have a pretty good idea as to what a desert is. And two of the bigger deserts that you'll hear about are the Atacama Desert in northern Peru, and northern Chile, southern Peru, the driest place on planet Earth, and the Sonoran Desert in northern Mexico, where we unfortunately hear about too many times people crossing the border, dehydrating, coming into the U.S., and unfortunate things happen when you're walking across a desert for 3 or 4 days and you don't have enough water. So I have a good idea what deserts are anyway. The other dry climate is steppe, and maybe one way to think of it is you step into the desert, and so usually you'll have a steppe and perhaps you'll have a desert nearby, kind of like we have here in the U.S., right, where Oklahoma or Kansas, it's pretty dry. It's not a desert, but if you go a little bit further into places like Arizona and so on, then you step into the desert. So the steppe is dry. It's not quite as dry as a desert, and perhaps and you will get some rains depending on where you are, how much rain you'll get. And again, so like Kansas, Oklahoma, those areas in the U.S. would be more like a steppe climate, and we tend to find the steppe in Argentina in the Patagonia region. All right. One other region we should mention, humid subtropical. This is where you would find the most fertile soils. This is where we tend to see a lot of soy being grown in Argentina, a lot of cattle grazing. This is somewhat like Georgia, something of this nature. So if you do want to plant crops, this is far better than clearing the rainforest. It's far better than growing them in the steppe. It's far better than growing them in the savanna because the soils are much better. They're deeper. You get more rainfall. It doesn't freeze. You have long growing seasons. So this is perhaps the most fertile area if one were to want to grow crops or raise cattle here in northern Argentina. All right, we have Mediterranean climate, and you're probably thinking, wait a minute, you can't have Mediterranean climate. We're not in the Mediterranean. Well, what's interesting is there are various regions around the world that have a climate similar to the Mediterranean, even though they're not in the Mediterranean. And we can see the Mediterranean. When we think of the Mediterranean, of course, we think of Italy and France and Spain and Greece and other European Mediterranean countries, and oftentimes we'll think, wow, those are really hot, dry summers. People sit around, they go to the beach and swim all day long, which is true. However, we want to keep in mind that in the wintertime, it's not like Florida. It's very cold, wet, windy, rain, blowing sideways at 40 degrees and 20 miles an hour. Not a good day at the beach for sure. So Mediterranean climate is not hot and dry year-round. It's very seasonal, where it's hot and dry in the summer, but very cool and wet in the winter. Usually we'll find Mediterranean climate around 40 degrees north or south latitude. Madrid is right around 40 degrees. Rome is right around 40 degrees north latitude, and a number of other cities. And what's interesting when we think of certain products that come out of the Mediterranean, perhaps one of them, right, is grape growing. And we take a look at our map here. Here's the equator, as you can see, running through the heart of South America, as well as the Congo and Africa. And if we put our lines of latitude on the map, we can see that in Spain and Italy, 40 degrees north, these are very much wine growing regions. We can see that line also extends over to California. Napa Valley is right around 40 degrees. And if we go to the southern hemisphere, we can see Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and of course Chile and Argentina, which are also very famous for their grape growing and wine production as well. So we can see the Rapel Valley right around 34 degrees south, and this makes sense that Mediterranean climate is very productive for grape growing and therefore the wine industry. And we see that all over the world, more or less around 40 degrees, give or take, you can find wine regions as long as you're near water. The city of Chicago is, of course, right around 40 degrees north, but it's not near an ocean, and as we know, we don't grow too many grapes in Illinois. So you need to have a significant oceanic influence in order to have the moisture necessary and the warmth to grow grapes to produce wine. Right, one more climate, marine west coast. This is on the other side of 40 degrees, 45 degrees south latitude, and it's a little bit different. Right, we mentioned Mediterranean climate was more like Napa Valley, whereas marine west coast, that's more like Portland, Oregon, or Seattle, where you get a lot of rain, or London or Paris, where it's rainy. It's much cooler than it is in Mediterranean climate. Grapes don't grow there nearly as well. And of course, we can see only on our map here, just sort of the southern portion of Chile is this marine west coast. And what that means is the wind is coming from the west, it's going over the ocean, and this is why it keeps it cool as well as rather damp because of all the rain. So think of Seattle or London or Paris or Portland, Oregon for this type of marine west coast climate. Another interesting climate is highland and alpine climate, which refers to the fact that as you go up in elevation, as we all know, we think of snow-peaked mountains, the temperature changes, it gets cooler, it gets drier, and obviously, depending what elevation you are sitting at, your climate is going to reflect that. A little bit higher, obviously it's a little bit colder, a little bit lower, it's going to be a little bit warmer, and also with altitude comes less moisture. If you're lower, once again, you're going to have more rains like you would anywhere in the tropics, and as you get up higher, right, you get above many of the clouds, and so you're going to have less rain. One region that's pretty interesting about talking about highland alpine climate is the Altiplano, and you can sort of look at the roots of those words. Alti, like altitude, right, meaning high. Plano is a word for plain, so this is the high plain. And what's interesting is where you find the legacy of the Inca in Peru is that there is a high plain, more or less in a trench between mountain ridges way up in the Andes. So all that snow melt and all the minerals from the soil and so on would run down the mountain, collect in the valley, and this is where the Inca thrived. And you can see llamas in the photo and so on. And so this is an amazingly fertile region, the Altiplano, despite the fact it's generally up over 10,000 feet. So if you go to a place like Machu Picchu, this is all within the Altiplano. Cusco is in the Altiplano. It's extremely elevated, but because of it's this trench between mountain ranges, it's very fertile soil. It's very habitable for humans and for animals. And if you wanted to settle at 10,000 feet, this would be the place because it's very fertile due to being a trench between two high mountain ranges.
Okay, pop quiz. Time to see how much you remember from this presentation. Take a minute to read through these questions and jot down your answers. You can pause the video. When you've got them, unpause, and we're going to check the answers. Number 1, humid continental is one of the climates found in Latin America. This is false. That climate type is not found in Latin America. Number 2, the Amazon rainforest is ideal for agriculture because it has deep and fertile soil. That is also false. The Amazon has very shallow and weak soils. The ideal place for agriculture in Latin America is going to be more like in the Argentina area. And finally, number 3, Latin American climate type. The Latin American climate type most similar to Seattle is the marine west coast.